The frozen expanses of Lake Ladoga became one of the most unusual theaters of World War II, where naval, aerial, and ground forces fought a contest dictated as much by geography and climate as by strategy. The siege of Leningrad, initiated in September 1941, placed immense pressure on the Soviet Union to sustain the city, whose survival depended on tenuous links across the lake. Ladoga, the largest lake in Europe, offered both opportunity and peril. It was the last viable corridor for supplies and reinforcements, yet it was also exposed to Axis efforts to sever that link entirely. Germany, allied with Finland and supported by the Luftwaffe, viewed control of Ladoga as essential to completing the encirclement of Leningrad, while the Soviets regarded it as the lifeline without which the city and its defenders would collapse. The lake's geography, shallow coastal areas, sudden storms, and extensive winter ice, meant that conventional naval tactics were only part of the struggle. Improvised fleets, armed barges, rivercraft, and ice convoys became as critical as destroyers and torpedo boats, demanding an unprecedented degree of adaptation by both sides. In the months before the first major clashes, each belligerent prepared according to its strengths and limitations. The Soviets, whose Baltic fleet had been largely confined by German minefields and coastal artillery, transferred smaller vessels and personnel to Ladoga, forming the Ladoga Flotilla. This included gunboats, minesweepers, and converted civilian craft, many hastily armed and crewed by sailors evacuated from bases lost in the Baltic. Their task was twofold: protect the road of life, the convoys that would bring food and ammunition across the lake and later its frozen surface, and interdict any Axis incursions. Germany, lacking a large naval presence on Ladoga, relied on the Luftwaffe, Finnish motor torpedo boats, and mine-laying operations to disrupt Soviet shipping. Finnish forces, with intimate knowledge of the lake's northern approaches, sought to pressure Soviet logistics by striking at lightly defended routes and staging points. Both sides recognized that the struggle would be as much one of endurance against the Arctic elements as of combat effectiveness, with ice, fog, and storms routinely altering plans. The opening phase of the campaign unfolded as German and Finnish planners tested Soviet resolve with probing attacks and bombardments in late 1941 and early 1942. The Soviets, driven by the desperation of Leningrad's starving population, began assembling ice roads and escort routes before adequate defenses were in place. Initial Finnish torpedo boat raids targeted isolated transports and attempted to mine approaches to Soviet ports such as Novaya Ladoga. But these actions were hampered by weather and the lake's treacherous conditions. German bombers and reconnaissance aircraft, however, proved far more effective, harassing convoys and striking depots along the southern shore. Soviet commanders, under immense political pressure, committed their scant resources to keep the road of life open, even at the cost of heavy losses. Command structures evolved rapidly, with the Ladoga Flotilla coordinating directly with the Baltic Fleet's remnants and the Leningrad front to ensure supplies reached the city. Strategic goals for both camps hardened as the siege lengthened. For the Axis, Lake Ladoga became the focal point of an indirect strategy. By severing the lake route, Leningrad could be forced to capitulate without a costly urban assault. Mines, fast attack craft, and concentrated airstrikes would serve as substitutes for a conventional naval blockade. For the Soviets, every ton of food, every artillery shell delivered across Ladoga justified escalating defensive measures. Soviet engineers fortified shore installations, deployed additional anti-aircraft batteries, and requisitioned riverine craft to bolster the flotilla's numbers. Miscalculations plagued both sides. German commanders underestimated Soviet resilience in ice transport, while Soviet leaders initially overestimated their ability to project naval power against Finnish and German raiders. Propaganda portrayed the convoys as heroic symbols, but behind the rhetoric, logistical improvisation and constant repair work kept the lifeline tenuous. The first significant engagements on Ladoga highlighted the peculiar nature of warfare on the lake. Soviet gunboats, operating in shallow waters, clashed with Finnish motor torpedo boats near the northern islands, forcing both sides to adapt their tactics to narrow channels and low visibility. Mines laid by German and Finnish units damaged several transports, sowing fear among civilian crews pressed into service. Ice convoys became the most vulnerable targets, with Luftwaffe bombers inflicting significant casualties during clear weather. Yet these early clashes, while disruptive, failed to deliver a decisive blow. The morale of Leningrad's population, already strained by starvation, suffered further as reports of lost convoys spread through the city. Soviet countermeasures, including armored escort vessels and the construction of new, more northerly ice routes, blunted Axis efforts to completely halt the traffic, though at the cost of enormous effort and coordination. As the campaigns on Ladoga intensified through 1942 and 1943, the theater became a study in logistical warfare under extreme conditions. Axis forces escalated their efforts with additional mines, improved Finnish boat patrols, and coordinated Luftwaffe strikes timed to coincide with convoy departures. Soviet improvisation reached new levels. Fishing trawlers were converted into minesweepers, icebreakers escorted the earliest convoys of each season, and decoy routes were established to confuse enemy reconnaissance. Casualties rose, not only from combat, but from the brutal winter elements, with frostbite and exposure claiming lives as readily as enemy fire. Political tensions flared as Moscow demanded uninterrupted supply to Leningrad, forcing local commanders to risk convoys in marginal weather. International observers, particularly from Allied missions in Moscow, took note of the extraordinary logistical feats and the human toll exacted by what was, to outsiders, a little-known but critical front. The peak of the Ladoga struggle arrived during the height of the siege, when both sides committed their greatest resources to either sustain or sever the lifeline. Large-scale Soviet operations employed coordinated naval, air, and ground elements to push Axis patrols farther from key routes. In turn, German and Finnish forces mounted concentrated efforts to mine harbor approaches, bomb storage facilities, and sink high-value transports. The fighting reached its most intense in late 1942, when Soviet reinforcements and supplies allowed the Leningrad front to plan future offensives. Civilian suffering was immense. Convoys could not keep pace with the city's needs, and each disruption threatened catastrophe. Evacuation efforts, moving hundreds of thousands of civilians across the lake, faced the same dangers as inbound supply runs, with numerous tragedies from both enemy action and natural hazards. Resistance and adaptation became the hallmarks of the later stages of the Ladoga battles. Soviet forces refined convoy escort tactics, deploying layered defenses including aircraft cover, minesweepers, and heavily armed gunboats. Partisan activity along the shores disrupted Finnish staging points and supply depots, forcing the Axis to divert resources. Resource management grew critical as both sides struggled to maintain operations with limited fuel, spare parts, and seaworthy vessels. The psychological toll deepened. Sailors and civilian crews endured constant exposure to danger, while commanders faced the unrelenting pressure of Moscow's directives and the unforgiving realities of the lake's environment. Nonetheless, these adaptations allowed the Soviets to gradually shift the balance, ensuring that the lifeline, while fragile, remained operational. The turning point came as broader Soviet offensives in early 1944 pushed Axis forces away from Leningrad's approaches, easing pressure on Lake Ladoga. A series of Soviet successes on land rendered many of the lake operations secondary, as the siege was lifted and overland routes reopened. While no single naval engagement determined the outcome, The cumulative effect of Soviet persistence and Axis overextension tipped the balance. German and Finnish forces, recognizing the shifting tide, curtailed their efforts on Ladoga, conserving resources for more pressing fronts. For the civilians of Leningrad, the reopening of more secure supply corridors marked the end of the most desperate phase of their ordeal, though scars from years of deprivation remained. As combat operations on Ladoga wound down, withdrawal and reallocation of forces followed. Soviet flotilla units transitioned to supporting offensive operations elsewhere, while Finnish and German detachments withdrew or redeployed. The immediate aftermath saw devastated shore facilities, numerous wrecks, and communities traumatized by years of fighting and deprivation. Humanitarian crises persisted as returning civilians faced destroyed infrastructure and limited resources. Yet the strategic outcome was clear. The survival of Leningrad, enabled in large part by the contested but enduring lake route, allowed the Soviet Union to maintain a northern front and later launch counteroffensives. The legacy of the Lake Ladoga battles extends beyond their immediate wartime importance. The naval and amphibious clashes, though often overshadowed by larger land battles, demonstrated the critical role of logistics and adaptability in modern warfare. For the Soviet Union, the Road of Life became a symbol of resilience, commemorated in monuments and museums. Historians debate the extent to which Axis operations on the lake might have altered the siege had they been more heavily resourced, but consensus holds that Soviet ingenuity and sheer determination prevailed against daunting odds. These engagements, fought on icy waters and beneath Arctic skies, remain a testament to the unconventional fronts of the Second World War, where survival hinged as much on human endurance as on weapons and tactics. The first winter of the conflict around Lake Ladoga introduced a dimension of warfare unlike any other on the Eastern Front, where the severity of the Arctic climate became as decisive as the strength of armies or the skill of naval crews. As the siege of Leningrad tightened in late 1941, the Soviet command faced a logistical nightmare. How to sustain a city of over 2 million inhabitants when its rail and land routes were severed, and when German artillery and Finnish patrols threatened every approach? The answer lay in the lake, which, as it froze, offered the only corridor to move food, fuel, and ammunition to the city while evacuating civilians to relative safety. The hastily organized route across the ice, soon dubbed the Road of Life, became the centerpiece of Soviet survival efforts. It was more than a supply line. It was a lifeline for a starving metropolis, and its defense became a matter of strategic urgency. From the outset, every movement on Ladoga was contested. The Axis, recognizing the vulnerability of convoys on the ice and open water, intensified reconnaissance flights and airstrikes, while Finnish torpedo boats and German-laid mines sought to capitalize on the lake's vastness and the Soviets' lack of a well-structured fleet. Command structures evolved under duress. The Soviet Ladoga flotilla, formed from remnants of the Baltic Fleet and civilian vessels, was tasked not only with escort duties, but with constructing and maintaining routes, clearing mines, and repelling raids. Its gunboats and improvised warships patrolled constantly, often operating in conditions where visibility was reduced to meters by fog or snow, and where drifting ice threatened to crush hulls. The crews, many of whom had been trained for blue water operations in the Baltic, quickly learned to adapt to Ladoga's unique challenges, converting fishing trawlers into minesweepers and deploying icebreakers to keep the channels open as temperatures plunged. Coordination with the Leningrad front was critical. Supplies moved by truck across the frozen lake had to arrive in step with military shipments, while anti-aircraft units ringed key staging points to deter Luftwaffe strikes. German and Finnish intelligence, aware of the growing Soviet reliance on the lake, devoted increasing resources to charting convoy schedules and targeting their most vulnerable points, aiming to choke Leningrad slowly without committing to a costly urban assault. The early movements across Ladoga were marked by heavy losses and frequent improvisation. Trucks and sleds braved unstable ice, often sinking when weight exceeded the crude calculations of Soviet engineers, while Axis bombers exploited clear weather to strike moving columns. Naval patrols on both sides were forced into a reactive stance. Finnish craft darted along the northern shores, ambushing isolated escorts, while Soviet gunboats and minesweepers rushed to protect vital arteries. It was not uncommon for Soviet vessels to be lost to weather alone, their hulls splintered by shifting ice floes or engulfed by sudden storms. Yet despite these hazards, the Soviets persisted, driven by the desperation of Leningrad's defenders and civilians whose rations dwindled to starvation levels. Each successful convoy, often delivering only a fraction of the city's needs, was celebrated in Moscow as a triumph, while each failure was studied for lessons that could prevent repetition. The High Command, understanding that Ladoga was now as crucial as any battlefield, began allocating scarce reinforcements and material specifically for its defense, including aircraft to patrol the skies and additional artillery to cover embarkation points. Key figures emerged during this phase, individuals whose logistical ingenuity became as vital as battlefield heroics. Soviet fleet officers devised rotating convoy schedules to reduce predictability, while engineers developed crude but effective methods to reinforce the ice with snow and water to bear heavier loads. Finnish commanders, exploiting their familiarity with the lake's terrain, orchestrated night raids that harassed Soviet movements, forcing the flotilla to divert escorts away from their primary convoy duties. Meanwhile, German Luftwaffe units began experimenting with coordinated bombing patterns aimed at cracking the ice to disrupt transport, turning the natural fragility of Ladoga into a weapon. These innovations on both sides underscored the evolving nature of the campaign. It was no longer simply a matter of moving ships or trucks, but of mastering a hostile environment while anticipating an enemy equally constrained by its challenges. The harsh climate, rather than deterring combat, became a backdrop against which increasingly daring tactics unfolded, ensuring that the battles of Lake Ladoga would escalate in both complexity and intensity as the war dragged on. The strategic objectives for both belligerents on Lake Ladoga took on sharper definition as the siege of Leningrad dragged into 1942. For the Axis, the lake was the single remaining artery sustaining the city, and severing it offered a chance to force Leningrad into capitulation without the risks of a frontal assault. German planners viewed Ladoga as a cost-effective front. With limited naval resources, they could rely on Finnish fast attack craft, minefields, and, above all, the Luftwaffe to disrupt Soviet operations. The Luftwaffe, already accustomed to operating in the region, dedicated bomber and reconnaissance squadrons to intercept convoys and locate Soviet supply points along the southern shore. The German naval detachment, working with Finnish forces, expanded its mine-laying activities, planting barriers near approaches to Novaya Ladoga and along known convoy routes. Finnish motor torpedo boats, adept at operating in the lake's northern waters, were tasked with rapid strikes against isolated transports and with escorting mine layers operating under cover of darkness. Their operations aimed to make the lake as hazardous as possible, forcing the Soviets to divert resources and reducing the flow of supplies to a trickle. The Soviet Union, in turn, refined its defensive and logistical planning to ensure that Ladoga remained viable as a lifeline. The Ladoga flotilla expanded significantly, bringing together remnants of the Baltic Fleet, hastily converted merchant and fishing vessels, and newly built barges outfitted with machine guns and light artillery. Its mission went beyond escorting convoys. Minesweeping, anti-submarine patrols, though no true submarines operated on the lake, Axis mine layers and small craft demanded constant vigilance, and shore defense became routine. Supply operations were meticulously scheduled, with convoys timed to coincide with poor weather that could mask them from Luftwaffe patrols, even though these same conditions increased the risk of navigation errors and ice-related disasters. Soviet engineers reinforced the road of life during the winter months by flooding and refreezing stretches of ice to create sturdier pathways for heavy trucks. On the southern shore, depots were concealed under camouflage nets and, when possible, in forested areas to reduce their visibility from the air. Despite these measures, losses remained heavy, particularly from German bombing raids that targeted convoys moving in daylight across open water or frozen expanses. Doctrinal differences also shaped the campaign. The Germans preferred to exert pressure indirectly, relying on mines, airstrikes, and sporadic fast attack raids rather than committing to sustained naval battles, which their limited forces could ill afford. Finnish forces complemented this approach by using their motor torpedo boats in hit-and-run tactics, often withdrawing before Soviet gunboats could respond. The Soviets, by contrast, sought to build layered defenses, pairing armed barges with minesweepers and using aircraft from nearby bases when weather allowed. They accepted high risks, prioritizing delivery of supplies even when escorts were scarce, reasoning that the survival of Leningrad justified the near-constant attrition of vessels and personnel. Propaganda emphasized the bravery of crews and the symbolism of each convoy, but internally, Soviet records reveal a relentless assessment of logistical weaknesses, with commanders repeatedly urging Moscow for more aircraft, minesweepers, and fuel. Miscalculations plagued both sides during this period. German and Finnish commanders underestimated the Soviets' ability to adapt, assuming that persistent air and naval attacks would soon make the route untenable. Instead, Soviet ingenuity, constructing new northern routes, building ice causeways, and deploying decoy convoys, kept supplies flowing, albeit at reduced capacity. On the Soviet side, overconfidence in their flotilla's ability to deter fast-moving Finnish craft led to repeated losses of lightly escorted transports, particularly in the northern sectors where Finnish patrols operated with impunity. Soviet attempts at offensive amphibious actions intended to disrupt Finnish bases along the lake's perimeter often failed due to poor coordination and weather, consuming resources without delivering lasting results. Both sides also employed information campaigns to bolster morale. German propaganda emphasized each sinking and bombing raid as evidence that Leningrad's fall was inevitable, while Soviet media turned the road of life into a rallying cry, portraying it as a triumph of resilience despite staggering hardships. These narratives masked the underlying reality that operations on Ladoga were tenuous for both camps, constantly at the mercy of nature and the limitations of their respective forces. By mid-1942, it was clear that no quick resolution was forthcoming. Instead, the struggle for the lake was evolving into a protracted contest of endurance, where the outcome would hinge not on a decisive battle, but on which side could sustain its operations through relentless attrition, brutal weather, and the mounting costs of keeping this Arctic theater active. The first direct clashes on Lake Ladoga unfolded in mid to late 1942. As both sides escalated their efforts to assert control over the supply routes and deny the enemy a secure foothold on the water. These early engagements highlighted the unique nature of the campaign, where small, agile craft, improvised vessels, and air power played a far greater role than traditional fleets. The Soviet Ladoga flotilla, strengthened by newly armed barges, converted civilian craft, and a handful of purpose-built gunboats, sought to protect the increasingly vital convoys that traversed both open water and, in winter, the treacherous ice roads. Finnish motor torpedo boats, operating from bases along the lake's northern periphery, initiated hit-and-run raids designed to inflict damage quickly and disappear into sheltered coves before Soviet escorts could respond. These encounters rarely resembled set-piece naval battles. Instead, they were sharp, sudden strikes, often at night or in fog, where survival hinged on speed, local knowledge, and the ability to navigate through narrow channels and shifting ice flows. The Axis campaign intensified with coordinated Luftwaffe strikes against convoys moving along exposed stretches of the lake. Bombers, guided by reconnaissance flights, targeted large barges and transport columns, particularly when poor weather temporarily grounded Soviet fighters. The psychological effect of these raids was nearly as significant as the material damage, as crews, many of them civilian volunteers or conscripts, found themselves under near constant threat from the sky. Mines added another layer of danger, with German and Finnish units laying fields near embarkation points and along suspected convoy routes. These devices, difficult to detect in the lake's murky waters, sank or crippled several vessels, forcing the Soviets to dedicate scarce minesweepers to daily patrols. Yet even as the hazards multiplied, Soviet operations persisted. Each successful delivery of flour, fuel, or ammunition to Leningrad justified the mounting losses, and each lost vessel or truck became a lesson in how to adapt routes, schedules, and escort tactics. Civilian suffering and morale intertwined with these military confrontations. Leningrad's population, already enduring famine and bombardment, followed the fate of the convoys closely. News of sunk transports or bombed ice roads spread quickly through the city, deepening despair, while reports of successful crossings brought temporary reprieve. Civilians were also frequent participants in these operations, driving trucks across the ice or serving as auxiliary crew aboard transports, often with little training. For many, the dangers of the lake were an extension of the siege itself, a daily gamble for survival. The Axis, aware of the psychological stakes, sought to amplify the terror of each attack, timing raids to coincide with peak convoy movements and targeting not only military cargo, but also evacuation efforts, in hopes of breaking the Soviet will to continue. Unexpected outcomes shaped the course of this phase. Finnish torpedo boats, while adept at ambush, suffered losses when Soviet gunboats began employing overlapping fields of fire and deploying smoke screens to mask convoys. Luftwaffe raids, though destructive, were increasingly challenged by improved Soviet anti-aircraft defenses and the gradual arrival of fighter cover from nearby bases. On the Soviet side, improvised offensives occasionally disrupted Axis operations, such as raids on Finnish staging points that forced the diversion of boats and crews for repairs rather than patrols. Weather, however, remained the most unpredictable factor, with sudden gales and shifting ice frequently canceling planned strikes or driving vessels aground. These uncontrollable elements often determined which side held the initiative on any given day, turning Ladoga into a battlefield where nature itself could be as decisive as strategy. By the end of 1942, the pattern of conflict on Lake Ladoga had solidified into a grueling rhythm of convoy protection, raiding, and aerial bombardment, with neither side achieving a decisive breakthrough. The Soviets succeeded in maintaining the road of life, albeit at a cost measured in ships, trucks, and countless human lives, while the Axis continued to inflict steady attrition without sealing the lake entirely. These first major engagements set the tone for the years to come. A war of persistence rather than annihilation, where each crossing, each patrol, and each air raid was part of a larger struggle to control not just a body of water, but the fate of a besieged city and the strategic balance of the Northern Front. The battles on Lake Ladoga reached their height during the brutal winter of 1942-1943, when both sides committed their greatest concentration of forces to either sustain or sever the fragile supply line. By this stage, the siege of Leningrad had entered its most desperate phase. The city's population, already devastated by starvation and cold, relied almost entirely on the convoys traversing the lake's frozen expanse. Every truckload of flour or coal became a matter of survival, and every successful crossing allowed the Soviet High Command to maintain a defensive front around the city. For the Axis, this was the moment to intensify their blockade, as the Wehrmacht sought to starve Leningrad into submission without diverting divisions to a direct urban assault. The lake became a concentrated arena of attrition, where both weather and weapons conspired to decide the outcome. German and Finnish operations grew increasingly coordinated, focusing on maximizing pressure at key points rather than spreading resources thinly. Luftwaffe bomber groups timed their raids to strike convoys during predictable movement windows, exploiting moments of clear weather to launch mass attacks on the long, slow columns moving across the ice. These strikes, often involving dozens of aircraft, aimed not only to destroy trucks and drivers, but to shatter the ice itself, creating impassable gaps that delayed or halted traffic for days. Finnish motor torpedo boats, when the lake thawed, expanded their patrol range, using the cover of night to attack isolated transports near the northern and central sectors, forcing the Soviets to commit heavily armed escorts even for routine crossings. German minefields, laid systematically along southern approaches and near harbor exits, increased their toll on Soviet vessels, with mines claiming cargo barges and smaller escorts that lacked the equipment to detect or disarm them. The Soviet response at this peak of the campaign was to escalate their own commitment to the lake. The Ladoga flotilla received reinforcements in the form of additional gunboats, icebreakers, and hastily armed trawlers. Anti-aircraft defenses were expanded along the southern shoreline and aboard the larger barges, creating mobile batteries to counter the Luftwaffe's attacks. Soviet engineers perfected their methods of strengthening the ice roads, flooding weak sections with water to thicken them, and building alternate tracks to circumvent bomb-damaged stretches. Convoys began operating in staggered formations to reduce the effectiveness of concentrated air raids, while decoy routes, manned by dummy vehicles and occasionally sacrificial crews, were deployed to draw Axis strikes away from the main flows of supplies. Coordination between the flotilla, the Red Air Force, and ground-based artillery reached unprecedented levels, turning the southern shore into a defensive network designed to shield the convoys until they reached the city. Civilian suffering intensified despite these efforts. Evacuations from Leningrad, conducted in parallel with supply runs, faced the same dangers, with countless refugees perishing when Luftwaffe bombers struck the ice or when trucks plunged through weakened sections. Those who survived the crossing often arrived in Soviet-held territory only to face hunger, disease, and inadequate shelter, as the logistical system strained under the dual burden of feeding a besieged metropolis and caring for its displaced population. For the crews operating on Ladoga, naval, military, and civilian alike, the psychological toll mounted as attrition became routine. Many sailors and drivers endured frostbite, exhaustion, and the constant specter of sudden death from bombs, mines, or the lake itself, which could turn lethal without warning under the stress of artillery and aerial bombardment. Strategically, neither side could claim a decisive advantage during this climactic phase, but the balance began to tilt subtly in the Soviets' favor. Despite grievous losses, the road of life continued to function, delivering just enough supplies to sustain Leningrad's defenders and prevent outright collapse. Each Axis success in sinking a barge or shattering a convoy was offset by the Soviets' ability to repair, reroute, and improvise. By late winter, the accumulation of supplies allowed the Soviet command to consider larger operations beyond mere survival, laying the groundwork for offensives that would eventually relieve the city. For the Axis, the high cost of sustained operations on Ladoga, combined with growing commitments elsewhere on the Eastern Front, began to erode their ability to maintain the same intensity of pressure. Although the lake remained a killing ground, the peak of the campaign marked the moment when Soviet endurance and logistical ingenuity started to blunt the Axis effort, setting the stage for the eventual easing of the siege. By the spring and summer of 1943, the Soviet approach to the Lake Ladoga campaign began to shift from one of desperate survival to a more calculated strategy of resistance and adaptation. The winter battles had proven that despite immense losses, the road of life could not be severed outright as long as the Soviets maintained their flotilla, their anti-aircraft defenses, and their engineering solutions on the ice. Now, with the lake thawing and the convoy routes returning to open water, Soviet commanders focused on refining their tactics and turning the Ladoga flotilla into a more versatile and resilient force. Gunboats, once primarily defensive escorts, were redeployed to conduct offensive sweeps, targeting suspected Finnish staging areas along the northern shore and disrupting Axis mine-laying operations. Minesweepers became more systematically coordinated with reconnaissance flights, clearing channels well in advance of major convoys, while icebreakers, no longer critical for thick ice, were adapted as floating platforms for anti-aircraft guns to shield supply lines during the thaw. Partisan movements along the lake's periphery began to play a more pronounced role in undermining Axis operations. These irregular forces targeted Finnish supply depots, ambushed small patrol detachments, and provided the Soviets with detailed intelligence on the timing and routes of Finnish torpedo boat raids. Although lightly armed, partisans forced the Axis to divert manpower to guard vulnerable positions, reducing the resources available for offensive action on the lake itself. The Soviets capitalized on this pressure by staging limited amphibious raids against poorly defended coastal points, designed not to seize territory permanently, but to destroy infrastructure and keep Finnish units off balance. While these raids rarely caused significant strategic damage, they contributed to a cumulative erosion of Axis control and morale in the northern sectors of the lake. Resource management became a defining challenge for both sides as the campaign entered this phase. Soviet engineers were tasked with repairing and repurposing damaged vessels, often salvaging wrecks from previous winters to extract engines and weaponry. Fuel shortages forced the flotilla to prioritize essential missions, with secondary patrols sometimes conducted by sail-equipped or minimally powered craft to conserve reserves. On the Axis side, Finnish torpedo boats and German-supported mine layers struggled with maintenance issues as spare parts grew scarce, and Luftwaffe support was increasingly redirected to more critical fronts in the south. This gradual reallocation of Axis resources allowed the Soviets to operate with slightly greater freedom, though attacks on convoys and ports remained a constant threat. The psychological strain on those operating around Ladoga deepened as the conflict dragged on. Soviet crews, though buoyed by the gradual improvement of supply rates to Leningrad, endured near-constant exposure to combat conditions, with minimal opportunities for rest or recovery. Many had survived multiple winters on the lake, each marked by relentless bombing raids, frigid temperatures, and the ever-present danger of mines or sudden storms. Axis personnel faced their own burdens, particularly Finnish sailors, whose small, fast craft demanded dangerous proximity to enemy escorts and minefields during their raids. The prolonged stalemate, with no decisive victory in sight, began to erode morale on both sides, even as high command pressed for continued operations. Despite these hardships, Soviet adaptation steadily tilted the balance in their favor. Convoys became more frequent and better protected, aided by layered defenses that combined surface escorts, air patrols, and shore-based artillery. New decoy techniques, such as false radio traffic and dummy convoys, diverted Axis air and naval units, reducing pressure on the main supply routes. Amphibious landings, while limited in scope, kept the northern shores unstable and denied Finnish forces the ability to consolidate their patrol bases. By late 1943, the Soviets had not only preserved the lifeline across Ladoga, but also begun to impose their own tempo on the campaign, forcing the Axis to react rather than dictate the flow of operations. These developments did not end the struggle on the lake, but they marked a decisive shift toward Soviet resilience becoming a form of counteroffensive momentum, setting the stage for the coming breakthroughs as the wider war began to turn in favor of the Red Army. The true turning point in the struggle over Lake Ladoga came in early 1944, as the broader strategic situation on the Eastern Front began to shift decisively in the Soviets' favor. The Red Army's offensives in the Leningrad and Volkhov sectors, culminating in the January operations that finally broke the German land blockade of Leningrad, fundamentally altered the lake's role in the conflict. Overland corridors were reopened, easing the city's reliance on the perilous water and ice routes. Yet, the Ladoga flotilla and its convoys remained vital in supporting Soviet troop movements and supplying advancing forces as the front lines moved westward. The shift from survival to offensive operations allowed Soviet naval and engineering units to redirect their efforts from desperate defensive measures towards supporting broader military campaigns. The lake, once a lifeline threatened by Axis raiders and bombers, now became a conduit for Soviet momentum, enabling the rapid redeployment of men and materiel toward the new offensives against German and Finnish positions. Axis forces, already strained by mounting losses and the growing demands of other fronts, were unable to maintain the same level of pressure on Ladoga. German Luftwaffe units, which had once dominated the skies over the lake during key convoy movements, were steadily withdrawn to face crises elsewhere, leaving only sporadic bombing sorties to harass Soviet operations. Finnish naval detachments, though still active, suffered from dwindling fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, which curtailed their ability to sustain large-scale raids. The once effective minefields, a primary tool for constricting Soviet movements, could no longer be replenished at the same pace, and Soviet minesweeping techniques had improved to the point where these obstacles, while dangerous, no longer brought convoys to a standstill. The Axis presence on Ladoga, formidable during the height of the siege, began to erode into a series of isolated actions, more defensive than offensive in nature. For the Soviets, this shift was more than a logistical reprieve. It marked a symbolic and psychological victory. The road of life, which had carried not only supplies but also the hopes of a starving city through 2 grueling winters, was no longer a fragile artery under constant threat, but a secure channel supporting a resurgent army. Soviet commanders used the lake to expedite the concentration of forces for the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive, ferrying troops and heavy equipment to forward positions while keeping overland routes clear for the mass of supplies feeding the expanding front. The Ladoga flotilla, now better equipped and experienced after years of attrition, was able to extend its patrols deeper into the lake, aggressively clearing remaining Axis obstacles and providing fire support to ground operations near the shoreline. Amphibious raids, which had once been limited and opportunistic, now became deliberate operations aimed at capturing or neutralizing the last Finnish and German staging points along the northern and western shores. The repercussions for both military and civilian populations were profound. For Leningrad's inhabitants, the reduction of danger along the lake routes translated into more consistent deliveries of food and fuel, finally alleviating the worst privations that had plagued the city since 1941. Evacuations, which had claimed so many lives in prior winters due to bombing and ice collapses, now proceeded with greater safety, allowing more civilians to escape the devastated metropolis for the interior of the Soviet Union. On the Axis side, the retreat from aggressive operations on Ladoga was a clear signal of shifting priorities and diminishing capabilities. German propaganda, which had long trumpeted each convoy sunk as a blow to Soviet morale, could no longer credibly portray the lake as a contested battleground, while Finnish naval forces, once a thorn in the side of Soviet convoys, found themselves increasingly confined to defensive patrols around their remaining bases. This turning point underscored how the battles on Ladoga were never purely about naval clashes or air raids, but about the shifting balance of endurance, resources, and strategic initiative. The Axis, unable to maintain the intensity of earlier years, gradually ceded the lake as the Soviets transformed it from a symbol of survival into an operational asset, supporting their broader offensives. While the fighting did not end abruptly, mines, skirmishes, and the occasional bombing raid still posed hazards, the momentum had irrevocably shifted. The survival of Leningrad, once teetering on the brink, was now secured, and the contested waters of Lake Ladoga had become a springboard for the Soviet advance that would carry the war closer to Finland and deep into the territories once held by Germany. With the lifting of the land blockade in early 1944 and the Red Army's advance beyond Leningrad, combat operations on Lake Ladoga began to wind down, though they did not cease abruptly. The final months of hostilities on the lake were defined by a transition from the intense, attritional struggles of earlier years to a gradual withdrawal and repurposing of forces. Soviet priorities shifted towards supporting offensives into Karelia and the Baltic region, turning the Ladoga flotilla into a logistical tool for troop and equipment transfers rather than a defensive shield for a starving city. Barges and gunboats that once protected convoys now ferried artillery, fuel, and construction materials to forward bases along the lake's northern and western shores, enabling the Soviet military to consolidate its gains and prepare for new thrusts against German and Finnish lines. Patrols remained active, but their focus shifted from convoy protection to clearing mines, escorting reinforcements, and maintaining dominance over remaining Axis naval detachments. For the Axis, these final phases were marked by retreat and consolidation rather than escalation. Finnish naval units, their resources depleted and their bases increasingly vulnerable to Soviet raids, curtailed offensive patrols and focused on safeguarding evacuation efforts and protecting their remaining positions along the lake's northern perimeter. German involvement dwindled even further, with Luftwaffe support reduced to occasional reconnaissance flights and sporadic bombing raids that carried more symbolic weight than strategic effect. Minefields laid during earlier campaigns became as much a hazard to Axis withdrawal as to Soviet advances, forcing both sides to engage in cautious navigation and clearance efforts. The lake, once a battleground of aggressive raids and relentless aerial attacks, had become a corridor for repositioning forces as the broader war moved decisively westward and northward. The immediate consequences for the civilian population were profound, though far from wholly redemptive. With overland routes re-established, the desperate dependence on the lake's convoys ended, but the scars of years of deprivation remained. Many evacuees who had crossed Ladoga under fire now faced the daunting prospect of returning to a shattered city, where infrastructure was devastated and basic necessities remained scarce despite improved supply conditions. Shoreline communities along Ladoga, repeatedly ravaged by raids, bombardments, and the demands of both occupying and defending forces, struggled to rebuild, even as the fighting ebbed. Wrecked vessels, unexploded ordnance, and derelict military structures littered the lake's shores, posing hazards to civilians and requiring significant Soviet engineering efforts to clear and reclaim the area for peacetime use. From a military perspective, the withdrawal phase underscored the extent to which Ladoga's strategic value had evolved. What had begun as a desperate logistical artery for the defense of Leningrad had become, by the war's end in the region, a staging ground for continued offensives. Soviet commanders repurposed the lake's transport networks, adapting them to supply operations that bypassed damaged roads and allowed heavy equipment to move swiftly toward new fronts. Amphibious capabilities developed during the siege were formalized into doctrine, with the lessons of Ladoga feeding directly into Soviet planning for subsequent operations in the Baltic and Karelia. The flotilla itself, blooded by years of attrition and improvisation, emerged as a more professional and experienced force, now capable of complex joint operations alongside ground and air units. Yet the end of hostilities on Ladoga did not erase the devastation it had witnessed. The aftermath was marked by the grim task of recovery, raising sunken transports, disarming mines, and salvaging damaged infrastructure along the shores. The lake, a symbol of both survival and suffering, bore the scars of its transformation into a battlefield, its waters concealing the remains of hundreds of vessels and the countless lives lost during the years of conflict. For the Soviet state, the immediate post-conflict focus was on using Ladoga as a functional artery for rebuilding efforts and military redeployment, even as its human and material toll lingered as a silent testament to the siege and the relentless battles fought across its frozen and open expanses. The battles fought on Lake Ladoga left a legacy that extended far beyond the shoreline of Europe's largest lake, shaping both the historical memory of the siege of Leningrad and the broader understanding of how logistics, endurance, and unconventional theaters of war could determine outcomes in modern conflict. For the Soviet Union, Ladoga became inseparable from the story of survival during one of the war's most harrowing sieges. The road of life, traversed by thousands of trucks, sledges, and barges under constant threat from bombs, mines, and torpedoes, became immortalized as a symbol of resilience and sacrifice. Monuments and memorials, erected in the years after the war along the lake's southern shore, celebrated not only the heroism of the sailors and drivers who braved the crossings, but also the ingenuity of engineers, flotilla crews, and partisans who ensured the lifeline endured despite overwhelming obstacles. In Soviet historiography, the Ladoga operations were woven into the broader narrative of patriotic endurance, presented as proof that determination and adaptation could overcome material inferiority and environmental hostility. Beyond commemoration, the battles of Ladoga had significant military implications. The experience transformed Soviet thinking about naval and amphibious warfare, particularly in inland and constrained waters. The improvisational tactics developed on the lake, such as the use of armed barges, decoy convoys, and multi-layered escort formations, were codified into doctrine and influenced later Soviet operations in the Baltic, Black Sea, and riverine theaters. The campaign also underscored the necessity of joint coordination between naval, air, and ground forces, as no single branch could guarantee the survival of the lake convoys alone. These lessons, drawn from a theater often overshadowed by larger battles, became part of the Soviet military's institutional memory, shaping training and strategy well into the Cold War. For the Axis, the legacy was more fragmented and introspective. While Finnish and German forces inflicted heavy losses and slowed Soviet supply efforts, their inability to completely sever the lake route highlighted the limits of interdiction when resources were constrained and environmental conditions unpredictable. Historians continue to debate whether a more robust Axis commitment, particularly greater Luftwaffe or Kriegsmarine involvement, might have forced Leningrad's surrender. Most analyses, however, conclude that even with heavier investment, the combination of Soviet persistence, the adaptability of the Ladoga flotilla, and the sheer scale of the logistical effort would have made a decisive Axis victory unlikely without diverting significant assets from other critical fronts. For Finland, the campaign remains a footnote in its broader war effort, remembered more for the strain it placed on its small naval forces than for any lasting strategic impact. The cultural and human dimensions of Ladoga's legacy are equally profound. Survivors of the convoys, both civilian and military, carried the memory of the crossings as defining experiences of the siege, marked by terror, deprivation, and the constant presence of death beneath the ice or waves. Post-war accounts, diaries, and interviews capture the duality of Ladoga's role as a lifeline that sustained hope and as a graveyard for countless lives lost to mines, bombs, and storms. In Russia, these memories became part of a broader narrative of collective sacrifice, enshrined in literature, film, and education, as emblematic of the endurance that ultimately secured victory. In the decades following the war, Lake Ladoga itself became a silent archive of this history. Wrecks of transports, gunboats, and aircraft rest beneath its waters, many still preserved by the cold depths, while along its shores, remnants of fortifications and depots remain as physical reminders of the lake's transformation into a battlefield. Archaeological and memorial expeditions, particularly since the late 20th century, have worked to recover artifacts and remains, underscoring the human scale of the conflict that unfolded there. These efforts, coupled with ongoing scholarship, have elevated Ladoga's battles from a peripheral story to a significant chapter in the historiography of the Eastern Front. Ultimately, the naval and amphibious clashes on Lake Ladoga illustrate how a seemingly peripheral theater could carry strategic weight, not through decisive battles, but through the cumulative impact of endurance, adaptation, and logistical ingenuity. They reveal a facet of the Second World War where victory hinged less on overwhelming force and more on the ability to survive, innovate, and persist in the face of nature's hostility and an enemy's relentless attacks. The legacy of these struggles endures in the collective memory of those who lived through them and in the historical understanding of how unconventional fronts could shape the fate of nations during the most destructive conflict in human history.